This is my NZXT H1 powerhouse PC. In addition to crushing noobs, it also crushes games with ease, renders in real time, and allows me to game and stream at the same time in 1440p with really high refresh rates. So I'm going to go pretty in depth on the parts I have in the PC and what the performance and temperatures are like with all of these parts, but I'm also going to go over the mods I've currently made and will make, like full water cooling, and also why I've stuck with this case for, I guess, over 2 years now. First up on the outside, the NZXT H1 is just honestly a really beautiful computer in my opinion. It has a pretty simple boxy design with nice sharp edges, but the black and the white color scheme of this case just really makes it pop. I love the contrast. There are holes around the left, back, and right side of the case for airflow, because on the right side you have your GPU, left side you have your CPU cooler as well as your power supply fan, and on the back is, some nice exhaust. Now let's take a look on what is inside of this case. So with the GPU that I currently have inside of this case, it's actually a bit difficult getting this top shell off. First I have to remove the screws down at the bottom, then while pushing down on the GPU, I have to pull up the top shell. It's a bit of a tricky process, and putting the case back on is even worse. You can feel the case sliding against the GPU. Luckily there aren't too many marks from it. I did have to remove the dust filter because the fans would rub up against it. So yeah, now that we have the shell off, you can see just how densely packed everything is inside of here. The motherboard and the AIO is sandwiched right into the center here, with the power supply up top behind this panel, and the GPU is on the other side of this metal panel. Down at the bottom here is where everything connects, and personally this is my favorite way to have everything connect. While it isn't always easy to attach and remove cables, it is just super elegant and it keeps the cables really well hidden. I'm currently running this PC with a Ryzen 9 3900X, an EVGA 3080 Ti, 32 gigabytes of DDR4 3600 CL16 Trident Z RAM, a 750 watt Corsair PSU. Then for the motherboard I have a Gigabyte X570 Aorus Pro ITX motherboard, and finally a Samsung 970 EVO 1TB SSD. So at the time that I built this PC, and honestly even now for its size, this thing is pretty beastly. It's super powerful, and like I said, it just crushes everything that I throw at it. Now, when you have a PC that has so many high performance parts, you start to worry about cooling and also noise. Fortunately, the noise is actually not too bad, and cooling is overall okay. There are definitely some things that I could improve, but I'll show you guys that in just a second. And let me actually walk through some of the mods that I've made, one in particular which helped with cooling and noise. So the first thing that I upgraded was the power supply. If you saw my other video, I upgraded from the NZXT 650 watts power supply. I don't remember the exact model off the top of my head, but I upgraded to the Corsair SF750 power supply. This thing is pretty great. It was the first thing that I actually upgraded in this PC. When I first got my 3080, I was having some small issues with the computer shutting down. It didn't happen that often, but it was still something that I didn't want to happen at all, so as soon as the SF750 became available, I got one. The upgrade process was pretty simple. I do have a pretty in-depth video though, so it's linked down below if you want to go check that out. I would say though that it's definitely worth it. The cables that it came with were much nicer, it provides you a much higher power limit, and despite running the 3080 Ti and 3900X at full throttle, it never had any issues. Another small benefit is that up at the front here, it clears up a bit more space for you if you need more space for cables or if you want to add in a display. The next thing I upgraded was the AIO fan. So the original AIO fan that this case came with was okay. It was an NZXT 140mm fan, but it was actually pretty noisy, especially when it ramped up. So I looked around and I found the Noctua A14, and it was well worth the $25 that it cost. It creates far less noise, it does a much better job at cooling, even at lower RPMs. I also made a video about the fan, which you can go check out below, but in that video I didn't actually do a sound test at different RPMs, which I do have here. So now let's actually get this thing on, and I'm going to run you guys through some benchmarks. So first I'll test it in Cinebench, then Heaven 4.0, and I also have benchmarks for Warzone as well as CSGO. A quick note, in order to track my temps and fan speed, I used Open Hardware Monitor. I logged the temps and speed and then used Excel to graph it out over time and fit a best line to the temps and speeds. If you know a better way to do this though, let me know down in the comments below. So the first test that I did was the Cinebench multi-core test, and for this test I got a 16,427 points. Keep in mind that Cinebench is CPU based, so we won't be touching the GPU, which is why here on these graphs you can see that our CPU temps stay around 94 to 95 degrees Celsius, and our fan speed ramps up between 1160 and 1240 RPMs. This brings us to the single core test where we got a score of 1261 points, and our CPU temperatures stuck around 80 degrees Celsius on average, and our fan was between 1000 and 1200 RPM. So with Heaven 4.0, this test kind of tests out everything. So with the GPU, we saw temperatures around 80 degrees Celsius, and then with our CPU, we saw temperatures around 73 degrees Celsius, with our fan beginning around 1040 RPM and ending up around 1160 RPM. With all this power going into the benchmark, we ended up seeing an average of 144 frames per second and a minimum of 40 and a max of 290. These are kind of a toss-up, I wouldn't really pay too much attention to this. So moving on to actual games, first up I used a CSGO benchmark. This is just a workshop map. It's an automatic benchmark that goes through a bunch of different scenarios and tests out what your frames per second are throughout the whole entire thing. So by the end of it, we saw an average frame rate of 450 frames per second, with our GPU temps kind of sitting around 70 degrees at the beginning and then ending up around 80 degrees on average towards the end. Then for the CPU temperatures, we saw it sitting around 80 degrees in the beginning, with it settling somewhere between 70 and 80 degrees. And then our fan speeds started off around 1000 RPM, just a little bit underneath it, and then ended up closer towards 1200 RPM. So the last game that I benchmarked is one of the best games available currently, and that is Warzone. So this game is actually super clunky, and honestly I would say that's not very well optimized for PC. When I was playing this, I don't have my settings to the highest settings available because otherwise I lose a lot of frames. So mine are sitting around medium, and I was seeing somewhere between 120 to 140 frames per second. Mostly around 130 frames per second though. For the temperatures, I saw my GPU kind of hovering around 70 degrees Celsius, and then my CPU temperature was just stuck at 90 degrees Celsius the whole time, and then my fan speed was starting off around 1100 RPM, kind of staying around 1160 towards the middle of the game, but what I think is more representative of what it would be if you're constantly playing this game for a longer period of time is the 1200 RPM. So a couple things that I actually learned from doing these benchmarks. One is that I should seriously consider GPU undervolting. It's not something that I've really done before, but it's also not that difficult. There's a great video from Optimum Tech that you can go check out down in the description below. I really recommend checking it out if you are dealing with high temperatures, or if you're even generally interested in small form factor PCs. I think that it's something that people generally do when you have a small form factor PC. Another side note is that while I was actually doing testing, I noticed some weird noise from my water pump, and that's something that I'll probably explore in another video just to make sure that it's not anything serious or something that I need to end up replacing. Okay, but now is probably the more exciting part, which is the mods that I'm going to make. There are a bunch of them, so I'll kind of list through them. So for the front of the case, I'm thinking of some way to build in a whole front display. It might not be able to take up the whole entire space that is available, but something that can take up as much space as possible. The next two things I want to test out do similar things, but there are two different methods to do it. One is a triple fan GPU exhaust setup, and another is just a simple 92mm fan exhaust. The 92mm has actually been applied to the version 2 of the NZXT H1, which I'll get into in just a minute, but yeah, it's something that we can actually replicate here anyways. Now, the next two things are rather simple, but more related to customization. The first thing is different front panels. So on Etsy or different forums, I've seen people who create different wooden panels or some sort of plastic panels for the front of the NZXT H1. And they have this for both the V1 and V2. It looks pretty sick, and it also seems like it allows a bit more airflow for cooling. We'll see if I actually end up sticking with one, but I'm definitely interested in testing one out. If I don't end up liking it, maybe I'll just give it away to someone who wants it. And the other customization thing would be to spray paint the sides of this computer, sort of some color modifications. I don't know exactly what color I would do yet, but I do have some ideas. Now, on some bigger things. First up is an entire backside of two large 120mm fans. So at the back here, we'll have instead a bit of an extension for the fans that we'll add, and then we'll stick on this metal panel on the back here onto that. So hopefully by the end of it, we'll only be adding on a couple of centimeters to the back. Maybe it'll look clean, we'll see. Second to last would be full water cooling. Now, a couple of people have done this before, such as Optimum Tech. I really recommend checking that out. It's pretty sick. So I want to see how I can do that here with a 3080 Ti Founders Edition that I have, along with probably a new processor. We'll see what processor I end up going with, probably Intel. We'll see what AMD releases, if they release it soon. But yeah, I think it'll be pretty sick, and we'll see if I can do it with just this 140mm rad. If I can't, then the last thing that I'm going to add will be a full rad to the back of this computer. So I'll remove the dual 120 or 140mm fans and instead replace it with a 240mm rad. We'll see if I can make it look good. I hope you will stick around to see that. And if anything else there excites you, then definitely be sure to subscribe. Now, if you're interested in the NZXT H1, then you should know that NZXT just released version 2 of this case, and it comes with a couple different upgrades. The first one is a GPU exhaust fan. So like I mentioned earlier, they put a 92mm fan in the back that helps exhaust some of the hot air. The next thing is they made the case slightly larger, so if you're considering larger GPUs, like I've kind of installed in mine, then the V2 would be worth looking at. And last but not least, they added a couple different ports to the front panel where the power supply is, but now that panel isn't actually removable, so adding a display to that case would probably be a little bit more difficult. Now, I think that's everything. I might have missed something, but there is also a price difference of $50. So when this came out, this was $350. Now that case is $400. It does come with a power supply, but I've heard some issues with it. It also comes with a riser cable, and basically everything is there ready for you to set up because they also have the wiring already mostly done. But just be aware that there are some power supply issues. I'd recommend checking out Gamers Nexus's video on it, since he went over those cases and he does a pretty good job of going pretty in depth on those. So yeah, that is essentially everything that I have to say currently about my NZXT H1. I really hope this was interesting, and if you have any questions, comments, or things that you think could have been improved, just let me know down in the comments below. I'm really excited to try and do these different modifications to the case. If there are any other modifications that you've seen around that you might be interested in seeing me do, then let me know as well. And besides that, I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.